All right, welcome. We are live. It is Friday, and we are still going with our 7-day series, live series for Teacher Appreciation Week. So first and foremost, happy Teacher Appreciation Week. It's Friday, so you made it to Friday at least, so that's good. We've been going every single evening this week at 6 o'clock Eastern Time, and we are still going tomorrow and Sunday as well. So it's continued this whole weekend. I've got my good friend, Chad Ostrowski here, and we're going to talk a little bit about instruction and instruction for today. So stick around, drop in the comments, let us know where you're watching from. If you have any questions for Chad about anything, we'll say everything's on the table. There are no boundaries at this point, so you can drop questions in the comments. We'll be answering those, hanging out, and just sort of me asking Chad some questions and talking around good instruction that we should be focused on right now. And we'll be back in about 60 seconds. All right, those last couple clips are from the 2019 Teach Better Conference, and it's just every time I see it, I'm kind of like, that was a fun time.
It was a good time.
And then that last clip, I can't tell if you are talking to someone in the audience or if I'm out there and you're yelling at me. And sometimes it messes with me. I'm not sure.
That picture. You can't see the saying in the background.
It was a great shot. That was a great shot there. So that was good stuff. So how are you, man? How are you doing? How's your Friday? How's the week been?
It's good, man. I got to speak live at a conference yesterday. I've been doing a bunch of strategic planning with administrators that districts we're working with, and getting some things off the ground for next year, which is kind of what we're talking about today, which is cool. I got Mike Shapanik logged on, and he's checking things out. Nikki Jacoby's here. Like, I'm good to get started.
We're in a good spot. We're in a good spot right now. And
just gets better and better.
Did you see what Holly just posted not too long ago? She just got Teacher of the Year for her district.
Holly Stewart.
Was building the district, whatever. Either way, congratulations. That's awesome. That was super exciting. I just saw that just before we came on. So congrats, Holly. That's awesome. So well deserved.
One of our amazing ambassadors. Yeah.
Yes. So super exciting. So I'm going to do this, even though like I'm pretty sure anyone who's watching knows who you are, but like you never know. So if someone's watching and doesn't know who you are, and they're like, well, I know Jeff, because clearly everyone knows Jeff, right?
Right.
But today's not about me. And they're like, I'm not really sure who this Chad Ostrowski guy is. So can you do the quick 30, 45 second? Who is Chad Ostrowski real quick?
Absolutely. I am Chad Ostrowski. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Teach Better team. I get to work with schools, teachers, and districts across the country, and I created something that we call the GRID method, which is a self-paced mastery framework that we help a bunch of teachers utilize in addition to the other amazing things we get to do and help schools with on the Teach Better team. And I'm really excited to be here with you, buddy.
Hey, thanks. Megan, good to see you as well. So I figure at some point we're probably going to talk about the GRID method. That might come up.
Maybe.
Okay, so Holly said it's for her school, not district, but thanks for thinking. You know what, Holly, and as far as I'm concerned, it's for the entire country. So
you're the teacher of our hearts.
That's I love it. Can we get some green hearts in the comments for Holly? That would be really great right now.
There you go.
So Chad, I do want to talk. We'll touch on the GRID method because so much of what we do comes back to there, and so much of what when we talk about instruction and good instruction, we get there usually one way or another. So we'll probably get there anyway. But I think something, a lot of people know you for the GRID method. A lot of people know us for the GRID method. I always joke that the GRID method's like our Big Mac, right? It's everyone knows about.
Yeah.
And so clearly everyone knows that you're passionate about this thing. You created it, like, we share it all over the country and stuff.
I
But I
think it's
think
okay. It's pretty neat.
I think a lot of people realize that for you, it's not always, hey, you should, you have to, you need to, whatever, do the grid method. It's more about if the grid method is the right solution to what the problem is, then obviously
Yeah.
we're super passionate about it. And so often what leads us there is the fact that, and I hear you say this a lot when we work with schools, is like, I don't care what you do in a grid method. I just want you to do to teach better, to teach good, right? To teach well, and to have good and to have good instruction in your classrooms, right? That's the goal.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, the grid method is a great solution that includes a lot of best practices, a lot of great instruction, and it's all kind of neatly packaged in one single framework. But it's never about a framework or an initiative or a thing that you got trained in on a PD. It's about meeting kids where they're at, growing them, providing the right intervention, providing the right motivation so we can grow kids. If you're doing all those things, you're probably okay with or without the grid method if all of those things are happening, right? And you're absolutely right. When I'm talking to schools or districts, I don't tell principals they need to walk into every room and go, are you doing the grid method? Because if you're not, you're doing bad instruction, because that's just not true, right? There's a million ways to reach students and engage students in progress monitor and make sure you're doing the best for those kids every single day. For any of us, even though we're biased and we like the grid method, to say the grid method is the only way would be silly, I think, because we've actually seen a lot of amazing teachers that don't use the grid method and are still reaching kids and growing kids. Now, one thing I will say is the grid method itself is an amalgamation of a lot of best practices. So most teachers are doing those little components and pieces of what makes the grid method work so well. And so I'm excited to kind of break down those types of things. Instead of going, hey, do the grid method, we can talk about, like, do these components, do these other things.
Let's do that. Let's break down a couple of those components. So when you're talking, you're talking to administrators, and we're working with the district, and we're talking about, it's not about, hey, you have to do the good method. It's you need to have good instruction. You need to have good best practices in place in your classroom. What are some of those components? Let's pull maybe one or two out right now. We can dive into those and we can keep building. But for you, maybe pick like what are one of those 1, 2, or 3 that are the absolute core, the foundation that have to be there for good instruction in a classroom? What are one of those components that we can pull out?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I'm learning more and more, the more schools and districts we work with, is that there are teachers that aren't ready to take the huge leap for self-paced mastery learning and tiered instruction that's individualized. Some teachers need like baby steps, right? So I sort of look at this as like a continuum of the edge of the continuum, the end of it would be sort of a utopian classroom where every single learner is getting an individualized instructional plan in a mastery-based setting that's tracked by the teacher, right? But we can't expect teachers, or anyone for that matter, to like take this huge leap from wherever they are and just automatically be there. Things like the grid method can help that. But I think you can break it down into some fundamental, really easy sort of questions. And the first question I like to ask teachers is, do you know the goal or the objective of what you're teaching? Do you know what the standard is that you're covering? Do you know the DOK level or the depth of understanding a student has to have to reach that standard? And then do you know how to measure if a student has met that standard? So that is sort of like a core instructional thing that if you're just flipping through the pages of your textbook, or you're just kind of pulling things off the internet, it may not be actually aligned to the needs of the standard. I have a funny story that made me realize how important this was, actually. I was teaching in middle school in Ohio, and the state standards had changed from one year to the next. The Ohio released new state standards, and one of the standards previously covered like sort of measuring weather. And that was like a huge focus, measuring and analyzing the data of weather. And then the water cycle was sort of like this other component. So I spent, no joke, like a month covering literally like measuring all this weather data. And so I go back to the standards and I look at them and I go, they changed the standards. So now they're a lot more focused on the water cycle alone as opposed to all these metrics and measuring. Now, my kids had a great time. They learned a bunch about measuring weather, but I literally wasted weeks of instruction because I didn't know where I was supposed to be going. So
Yeah.
like, and it sounds oversimplified, but we need to know where we're going so we can get our kids there.
So
Like, go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna say, and you might have just been going there, so I apologize. But let's dive in deeper in that. So, like, if I'm sitting here and I'm listening, I'm going, "That's you're right. I need to know where I'm going. I need to know how to do it." What if I don't? What are the steps I need to take right now if I don't know where I'm supposed to be going? If I you mentioned alignment, and we talk about a lot about that when we're
Sure.
aligning with work we do. But if I've never done that, like, how do I do that? How do I make sure that what I'm doing is aligning with my standards and that I know how to where I'm going and how to assess and measure whether my students are getting there?
So one of the biggest things that I see, and I understand why it happens, I absolutely appreciate and understand why it happens, especially if you've been teaching for a while, is like task focused planning. So when you say, I have a unit on in an ELA classroom, I don't think I'm covering character development in plot analysis and citing textual evidence. I think mice and men unit. I think The Great Gatsby. I think Romeo and Juliet. So I stop thinking about the instructional outcomes and I start thinking about the tasks in the project or the thing that I do with my students. And I understand why this happens. And it's really easy to get comfortable doing that. But if we never step back and go, is this task actually meeting what the standards say? Or am I trying to cover too much? So I'm actually covering nothing. That's another thing that I've seen a lot of teachers do is they say, well, I'm covering all of these standards. And I say, well, if you're trying to cover everything all the time, you're actually covering nothing, right? Like that's like digging like a 3-mile wide ditch that's an inch deep, right? It doesn't really do a whole lot of good. Whereas if you actually step back and go, what are the topics that I need to cover based on the state standards, the standards that I'm supposed to be reaching? What is the DOK or Bloom's or Costas or whatever taxonomy you want to use? What is the cognitive level that the students need to reach, right? So that's the second tier. Like the first step is, what am I supposed to teach, right? Like we need to know that. That's like a level 0 sort of thing. What are the expectations?
When's the last time I looked at my standards, right? When's the last time I actually pulled?
If you haven't looked at your standards in 5 years, maybe go crack it open. Take a look. And that's like, I hope that's not something we have to dig too far into because that just makes logical sense.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
And then the next step is like, what is the cognitive or depth that the standard asks us to go? So what is it asking us to cover? And what is I like to use DOK personally, but what is the depth of knowledge or the cognitive depth of the task or the standard that we're looking at? This becomes really important because once again, sometimes we generalize as educators and we go, oh, that's just the unit on water cycle, or that's the unit on graphing equations, or that's the unit on the causes of World War II, right? And what does it need the student to know about World War II? Are they comparing and contrasting events, times, events, and places? Or do they just have to know who, what, when, where, and why? Those are two very different cognitive tasks. And sometimes teachers will say, hey, I know they just need to know the steps of photosynthesis randomly. So they spend 3 weeks talking about photosynthesis, when if you reread the standard, it's asking a student to analyze the products and the effects that environmental factors have on the production of the products of that process. So you could essentially waste a lot of time if you don't know these things about your standards. And that, to me, it's boring, kind of. I think it's fun, but most people don't, right? Like that's like the nuts and bolts and the nitty gritty of teaching that most people don't want to do because they're like, I know my stuff. I'm just going to teach the topic that this is covering, right?
Sure.
But I want to like kind of warn people about that and go, just step back, evaluate and norm what you're teaching to the standard that you're supposed to be teaching to. Because if you haven't done that in a while, you can save yourself a bunch of time. And if you know where you're going to get there more efficiency. So that's definitely sort of like the first pillar or the big kind of first step I would have any teacher think about as they discuss their instruction.
So then, so that's looking at where do I need to go now? One of the other pieces you mentioned was ensuring and making sure that I'm ready to assess and measure whether my students are getting there. So take us through that now. So now we've looked at the standards. We know where we need to go. How do we make sure that we are assessing properly and making sure our students are getting what they need when they need it on their path to get to there?
Sure. So the next thing we need to do is identify what are those key questions, terms, skills that exist within this standard that I need to give my students or that they can do to prove that they've met this need, right? Now, one thing you'll notice is that I have not talked about the instruction yet. I have not talked about what we're actually giving kids to do, because to me, that is the last thing we need to think about. Because if we don't know what we're supposed to be covering and we don't know how we're measuring it, planning what the students are going to do seems pointless to me, because now we're just shooting in the dark, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where saying, I know that this standard's at a DOK level 3 or a 2 or a 4, depending on what those what level of cognitive rigor the standard's asking. Now I can say, if a student can do X, Y, and Z, they have met this standard. So now I have identified the skills, the knowledge, the understanding, or the mastery level that the student has to reach to prove that they have met that standard. So once you know this is what they need to meet the standard, and this is sort of like the next progression, we can now build an on-ramp so that the student can reach that level. Because just knowing that they need to reach a certain level and just starting to teach at that level, I think is a mistake, because your students don't have the foundations, they don't have the structure, they don't have the scaffolded understanding to just hop to level 3 of a comprehension, utilizing something like DOK. So that's truly, to me, going, okay, well, if they need to know it at this level, what are the subsequent questions? What are the lower foundational questions they also need to know to approach mastery at this level? So what are the foundational skills and knowledge, maybe from prior grade levels or just built into the at grade level standard? What are those approaching sort of content pieces where they're almost there, but maybe not quite? And then what are those meeting the standards? And then we can even look, what does exceeding the standard actually look like, right? Now, if you're a standards-based grading teacher, you're going to recognize some of these sort of verbs that I'm using. Usually, like, we think of standards-based grading as like a 4-point scale. I'm not going to open up that whole can of worms just yet. We can talk about it later. But you'll notice that the idea of meeting or approaching or developing understanding versus exceeding understanding of a stated standard, if we understand these things fundamentally, we can create learning opportunities that are scaffolded and provided in a way that continually build, spiral, and enhance learning in the classroom.
Okay, so what are let's move on to some of the other components that we could pull out that is part of good instruction. That we haven't talked about so far. What are some of the other ones?
Absolutely. So now if we know what am I covering, what is the level that I need to cover, what are the questions, and how am I going to measure this? Now we can actually start talking about what resources do I have, what curriculum, what texts do I have to build this instruction, right? So the other big thing is active learning. So one of the things, and we've actually seen this in schools, you and I used to do this all the time back in the early days of the Teach Better team, where we would walk through schools and we'd walk through one class where half the kids had their heads on the desk because the teacher was just kind of up in front and like lazy, like just kind of laying down, not paying attention. One kid's looking out the window, not a whole lot going on. You go to another class, right? And the kids are actively engaged in the process.
Oh yeah, I remember several times. Literally, we were walking through hallways, and I actually remember. I don't remember where we were. We're not gonna say it anyway. where you got me and you're like, hey, I'm like, I want you, we're gonna walk down this hallway. Like you had just come down the hallway because I want you to look right, then left, and right, and then right again, because it was like heads down, nothing, or just very still, like kids just kind of like this. And then the next class, it's like kids were up and moving. They're all over the place. And the next class they would, and it was just, and there was nothing like, oh, good teacher, bad teacher, nothing like that. It was just literally active learning, passively just sit there, active learning. And it was crazy how different it was. So sorry, that's just like I literally pictured the hallway in my head from like 5 years ago. So
you can walk through any school in the world and see that same thing.
Yeah.
100%. Hopefully you see more of one than the other, but most of the time you can see that. Now, one thing every teacher should ask themselves, and this is my favorite question, is if your students left the room, would the lesson or instruction change? Right? Because if they're not required for the lesson that you have planned, they're not learning a lot, probably, right? Like here's the thing. If teachers view themselves as delivery machines of content, they have been replaced by something that every one of their students, most of their students, have in their pocket, right? I can YouTube definitions. I can Google basic facts, right? So how are we getting students active in the learning process, struggling so that they're actually growing in our classrooms, as opposed to there's this old archaic model of instruction where we view students as sponges, right? So really early in the education system, it was like there's literally images that show that we thought education was like, if we just spew out enough information, they'll just absorb it and it'll just go into their heads. Yeah. And that is,
we just have to cover it. We got to cover it all. Gotta make sure to expose it to them.
Everyone's about
expose
covering
them to it. Yeah.
And this is such a broken idea, because without active engagement in that process, very little learning happens. That's why, educational theories like constructivist understanding and inquiry-based learning and all of those things started to emerge, because we realized for students to assimilate new knowledge, they had to take part in the conversation. They had to take part in action in the process of learning. And if you fast forward 50, 60, 80 years at this point, we know a lot more now. And we know that active classrooms are more effective. Students stop listening after about 15 minutes, or retention goes way down after about 15 minutes. So these older archaic models that don't have students being active in the process are one of the most detrimental things to learning, in my opinion, right? The teacher center model needs to not exist anymore. We need to have student-centered instruction happening in more classrooms than ever.
So I'm going to bring up, because we had a question coming specifically about the grid method. So we'll go ahead and we'll touch there for a minute. So how can we use the grid to help kids make sense of the information instead of telling them what information they need to know?
So with things like self-paced mastery, like the grid method, the teachers got to think about the action that the student is taking, right? So instead of a 45-minute lecture where I talk about the parts of a cell, maybe there's a 5-minute video or a mini lesson, and then an activity where the student's doing something with that information. Then the teacher is using what we talked about already, which is assessing their understanding of what was covered or acted upon on that given activity. So once again, this goes back to exactly what we're talking about. We're getting students active in the learning process. We understand the level at which they should understand it at a given time in the instructional pathway, and we know how and why we are assessing them, as opposed to random questions. They're tiered, they're targeted, they're quick, and they're showing that the student's ready to take or do the next step in their learning.
I think something that popped in my head with Mike's question there is that you need to provide them with the opportunity to discover information, to learn, right? You can provide the pathway, but give them the opportunity and that's to be actively involved and take the opportunity to discover, versus saying, hey, go there because you're supposed to do that, right? So I think that's,
Yeah,
and you were alluding that with, like, that's what you were saying, like with the active learning, you get them involved in it so that they're learning by being actively involved versus, oh, I'm writing down definitions because Mr. Ostrowski said I need to know these definitions, right? Versus I'm
sure.
learning these definitions because I'm actively involved in whatever project or process I'm going through.
Absolutely. And there's one of my favorite quotes. I used to um, try to live by in my classroom. And if you try really hard, like this is actually a really great exercise for any teacher to do. You can do this literally tomorrow in your classroom. Try not to say anything to your students that they can
You
say
can't say it.
themselves, right? So, like, this is really, really difficult to do when you first start, but the better you get at it, the more you force your students to think and respond, right? So, if a student says, "What time is it, Mr. Ostrowski?" I'm not going to go, "It's 6:27." I'm going to say, "I don't know. Where can we look to find the time?" I can look over there. Okay, what does the clock say? There you go. You now answered your own question. Now, that seems super minuscule and arbitrary, but if you actually take this to its natural conclusion, you are literally teaching your students the mental progressions and the processes they need to solve everyday problems and problems in your classroom. I used to have students in my class that would go, "I better not ask a question because I should try to figure it out first. Because if I ask Mr. Ostrowski a question, he's gonna ask me 8 more."
Exactly. Yeah,
And so you're training, and I'm not saying that my students didn't want to ask me questions. They just knew what my expectation was. And then
absolutely. Yeah.
I would funnel those questions until they could tell me what they needed to know. So I would guide the conversation, but you better believe some of my students wouldn't ask me like just really simple questions they could Google or look up or like spend half a second looking at the directions, right? Now, I want to be cautious here. This is very hard to do if you've never done it before. But if you consciously, like, this is just a great student centered exercise you can do, like when you go to the classroom on Monday. Like, literally, don't say anything if your students can tell you it themselves. Lead with questions, answer questions with questions to funnel them so that they can answer it themselves. And that will pay you back over time because your students will learn those pathways, those thinking pathways, and those processes to find information and think for themselves.
I also think that's a big piece of the ownership of their learning being shifted back to them versus
Right.
just being given. Right. I'm thinking it's similar to that I was thinking about when we were in Ray Hewitt's class. Gosh, it was several years ago now, but I have this little clip of memory in my head that always comes back of a student coming to her and asking, "Hey, can I do XYZ or whatever?" And Ray literally just like stood there looking at her and goes, "I don't know." She's like, "Well, but can we do?" And she just kind of looked at her, and and then it clicked. And the student realized, "Oh, that's right. Like this is Miss Hewitt's class. I can do this. I own this, right?" So it's the same thing where that's really hard to do because usually when someone comes and says, "Hey, can I?" you say yes or no, right? If they ask, "What time is it?" your response is, well, it's, and so I think that's really difficult to do. But man, it's awesome when you watch a classroom where the students aren't asking those questions and the teacher's not spending time answering where's the password at, where are our targets posted, those types of things. So I
And
that's
so,
a
so
that's good
you,
advice.
yeah, you always have two choices. You either stop thinking or you force it to continue. Like
Yes,
that's literally because
yeah.
like the minute you answer a question, you've gone, you don't need to do any more work, no more thinking. I just handed you the answer and we're good. And you are literally training your students to look for the quick fix every single time instead of going, "I don't know. What do you think? How do you think that should go? What do
Hmm.
you think this means? Remember when we talked about this? Well, what was that? What does that mean about this other thing?" Right? And it takes longer. I promise it does. It's not quick, but it's one of those things that if you build that culture in your classroom and and that leads us to things like focusing on knowledge rather than finding the answer all the time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Especially math teachers, right? What's the answer to number 7? 2. What did we learn? Nothing. like you
Sure. Yeah.
like no learning has occurred because I just gave you what the number was that arbitrarily is the result of this calculation. How about,
Yeah.
I don't know, what process should we do here? What is the first step? What is the next step? What do we have to remember about this? Yeah, I'm telling you, you got 20 thinkers in your class, 30 thinkers in your class. They can do a lot of thinking. They don't need you to tell them everything.
And what you're doing with these little practices, these little things, is you're teaching them how to be learners versus it, I'm trying to think of a word, I guess, acceptors of direction, right? You're teaching them how to go navigate for themselves, how to find answers for
Sure.
themselves. And in a world where we have things like Google and YouTube, like that's incredibly powerful to know that you can go find things and that you're not reliant on anyone else to give you the answers and give you everything you need. So, all right, so we talked about knowing where we need to go. We talked about understanding how we're going to measure our students getting there. We talked about then like building the pieces and looking and reflecting back on like how are we aligning what's going on, the learning opportunities. What are some of the other pieces? So I'm kind of I'm picturing myself as a teacher who maybe I put together a grid. So I've aligned my standards. I've aligned my assessments to that. I've tiered my assessments. I've built everything on DOK. I've got a lot of really great activities for all my learning opportunities. And everything's aligned. And now I'm going into like, I've got the plan laid out, the path laid out, but my good instruction doesn't stop there, right?
Sure.
So what comes next? Like I've got a really solid plan. I feel really good about where we're at, where we're going, how I'm assessing, how I'm leading there, the opportunity to get them. Now what? And we kind of touched on that with some of the question and stuff like that. But what is there now? How do I make sure now that all this prep work that I've put in, I continue this good instruction to
Yeah.
effectively, implement it?
So we built the machine. Now we have to start
Yeah,
the machine.
exactly. Yes,
Right?
that's a good way to put it.
We've,
Yeah, I like that.
we put all the gears and screws in place and the belts are on and everything's ready
Yep.
to go. And now we got to fire the thing up. How do we keep it going and running smoothly? And the first thing that we need to do is know where our kids are. This is where things like progress monitoring, whether you're doing the grid or not, you need to know where your kids are in the process of learning. And this is one of my biggest pet peeves when a teacher goes, I'm pretty sure I know where most of my kids are. Like they'll just and I'm like, okay, but that's not very scientific as far as I'm concerned. Where's that kid? What do they know? What do they need to work on? What does this kid need to work on? What are they working on right now? Can you tell me to moment? Most teachers can tell you week to week. Most teachers can tell you that. Some teachers can tell you at the end of a day. That's even better, right? I want a teacher to be able to tell me minute to minute in their class. I want to know between the first minute and the 10th minute who learned what and how far did they progress. That's what true differentiation happens, because here's the next best practice in education we need to talk about: differentiating, meeting kids' needs, and growing them, helping them, and motivating them. You can't do any of that if you don't know where your kids actually are. Right? Now,
Yeah.
some teachers go, well, I have map data. It's 3 months old. Stop it. That doesn't mean anything. Okay? Literally doesn't matter, in my opinion. Right?
Yeah.
Because how they're doing right now in your classroom compared to 3 months ago could have completely changed. Right?
Absolutely.
So I'm talking moment to moment, real time assessments, progress monitoring, knowing where those kids are at and what they need. Now, this is already happening if you're running the grid method effectively in your classroom. But even if you're not running the grid method effectively, you can still progress monitor your students. You can still pull small groups. You can do small group intervention and do stations and centers and all of these other practices. But none of that stuff is going to be very effective if it's not meeting the needs of your students. The only way you know if it's actually helping your students is if you know where your students are, right? So to me, that is a critical element that I think a lot of teachers miss. We know why we're supposed to do an exit slip at the end of the class. We know why we're supposed to do a weekly check-in or quiz so we can identify where my students are or if they got it or not. But those are arbitrary things if you're not doing anything with that information. One of the biggest crimes in education was we had this huge push for assessment over the last about 10 to 15 years. And you know me, Jeff, I love assessment, especially if it's done right. However, We have had this huge push for assessment, formative assessment, entrance tickets, do nows, exit slips, bell work. We should be assessing, 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 assessing. None of it matters if you're not doing anything with it, right?
Mhm.
Me ending a class with an exit slip and going, well, 10% don't know it. I'm going to do the same thing I was planning anyway. Like,
Yeah,
you have literally just
sure.
broken the entire system and the reason why you did the assessment in the first place. We need to be able to adapt and respond to those assessments. They need to be good quality assessments that are measuring what they want, what we want to measure as educators. So by progress monitoring, we can look and see, right, if a student's ahead or behind or right where they're supposed to be, and then modify instruction moment to moment, day to day, week to week in our class to meet those students' needs. So to me, progress monitoring is one of the most important pieces of the grid method itself, but it's also, I think, regardless if you're using the grid method, I think it's vital to at least day to day be understanding where are your students at. And then I would challenge every teacher, how much can you know about your students in a class period, right? Like, how much can
Yeah.
you figure out about what they know and what they don't know in a class period? It doesn't always have to be till the end of class where you find out a kid's ready for the next assignment, right? So maybe you're not ready to do a whole grid, but maybe grouping in 3 assignments at different tiered levels for your students to work on, right? And we even have courses like bite-size mastery that show teachers how to do that in a smaller,
Yep.
chunked out way.
Yeah.
So there are real solutions that teachers can implement on a smaller scale that don't require them to blow up the entire idea of what they think education is. So it's really about, where are your kids at? What are you doing to meet their needs? If they're not meeting your needs, what are you doing to intervene? And if they are meeting your needs, what are you doing to further engage? Like, those are sort of like the fundamental questions you need to be able to ask, answer about any student in your class. Where are they at? Where are they going? If anyone's not getting there, what am I doing about it? If anyone's already there, how am I keeping them engaged and growing? Or are they stagnating, right?
Yeah.
Because our responsibility as educators, and which is why we appreciate them so much, is it's to grow every kid every day. Every kid every day. Not just the middle, not just the top 10%, 100%, bottom 10%, middle 80%, top 10%, every day, every seat, every kid.
So you mentioned this, and a lot of what you just went over comes back and touches this and is included in this. But you mentioned differentiation, which is a word that gets thrown out around a lot.
Sure.
And sort of the comment, I know Ray Hua jokes around about this, and we have too, is like, well, I printed my stuff out on multiple colors pages, right? And so I'm differentiated, right? Because this one's that whatever. So touch on that, because the progress monitoring goes into that. The intervention of understanding where your kids are at is so much of how we can actually differentiate. But if you could take a second, I want to have you kind of go for a second on 2 things: what differentiation is not, and then what it is.
Sure. So what differentiation is not? It is really hard when I hear a teacher say, I'm differentiating, but everyone's doing the same thing. Like, that's just a really hard thing for me to digest as an instructional coach, as a trainer, as based on the thousands of teachers I've worked with. It's a thing that really irks me. And here's why. There is no argument anyone can make to me that 30 kids in the same moment are ready, able, at the appropriate reading level, math level, understanding, cognitive level, and everything else that goes into learning, engagement level, to do the same thing at the same time in the same moment. I would literally rather buy a lottery ticket, right? Like, I would bet, right, that so you having a hunch that your kids got it from the day before and they're ready for this, stop it. You're wrong. Because some of them didn't, and some of them already know it, right?
Yeah.
So I would argue that any less than 3 degrees of some sort of differentiation or modification that's available to students in the classroom is not doing enough. So one one of the things that I like is if you think of approaching mastery, meeting mastery, exceeding mastery. If you think in your head, like, here are the 3 scenarios that a student could be in my classroom. And I am going to place students based on either pre-assessment or formatively assessing them in one of these groups. Like, that to me is the easiest way to like truly differentiate instruction, right? But what differentiation is not is modifying minimally a task to say you differentiated it. Putting a bigger font on a piece of paper is not differentiating it. Me, like, potentially, yes, crossing out a couple answers could be differentiation, maybe. But then which ones do you cross out? Why did you cross those out? Are you just reducing the number of questions? So now this goes back to our first thing. Which ones did you take off, and are any of them too important to take off? Right? So all of these things need to be considered. So at this point, we need to get into a conversation about like universally designing instruction.
I'm so glad you went there, because I was literally about to ask you. I was in my head. I'm like, as soon as he gives me a chance, I'm going to ask him. All right, so talk to me about differentiation versus or in partnership with universal design for learning, UDL.
Absolutely. So for me, there's a really easy way to distinguish these two. Differentiation happens after instruction is already started, right? Like, I'm in the middle of my lesson. I notice a kid's having trouble reading, so I offer some read aloud. I have differentiated for that student in that
based
moment.
on what they need,
based on
which is where the
needs,
progress
right?
monitor and the assessment comes in. Yes.
So that's the differentiation piece. However, universal design, I think, is where the magic happens. And that's, I think, a lot of where the grid finds so much success, because you're designing an instructional environment with components of individuality and individual needs and interventions built in before instruction starts, right?
Yeah.
So differentiation happens live in the classroom while it's happening. Universal design is pre-planned to already be built in.
Yeah.
And it is based, for me, on the premise of what's good for the lowest student. I'm going to say that in quotes. For the lowest student in your class is good for every student in your class. So if you design instruction that meets the needs of your quote unquote lowest student and your highest student at the same time, which self-pacing does really, really well, by the way, at the same time, every student in your class benefits from that, because now you've created an environment that is universally designed for every learner in your classroom, because you're hitting the top ends of the spectrum. One of my favorite analogies is when we think about instruction, I like to think about a handicap ramp, okay? So if I put a ramp that leads up to a doorway, everyone can use it. It literally helps everyone in the scenario. But stairs actually stop some people from being able to approach the building, right? So like, what ramps are we building so that every single student can reach the door and open it?
Yeah.
Because I can walk up a ramp. A person who's differently abled can use a wheelchair to get up the ramp. A person on crutches can get up the ramp easier. So I'm literally creating a single solution that is universally applicable to every student getting to the same point.
Yeah.
Versus saying, sorry, there's stairs. Someone can help you if you want.
Well, so that's
actually the difference between universal design and differentiation. If I have a person inside the building that I have to call to come and help me get up the stairs because I can't go upstairs, that's differentiation, because I'm already at the building. Now I'm late for my meeting or whatever is going on.
Yeah.
If there was just a ramp that was pre-designed so that I could have access to where I need to go, everyone can get there and no one has to think about it because it's baked into the cake.
Yeah. So our good friend Katie Novak told me once that like UDL is the design, and you've said it a few times, like the word environment. It's the design, the design process that builds the environment that allows for differentiation to happen, right?
Correct.
Because calling someone to come down and get them is going to hopefully get that person into the building, but it's a whole lot more work, takes a lot more time, right? And it isn't the best solution for that person. Versus if I built a building that allows anyone to get there, that's one piece that I no longer have to differentiate with. Right. And now I can differentiate when the person gets in the building for whatever reason they were coming to that building for. Right. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. Okay. Gotcha. Dave wants you to just go for 12 hours. So I hope you ate your Wheaties, buddy. So let's, all right, so let's keep going. So differentiation, can we talk just a minute on, and because I know we have focus on focus going on where they're doing, Dave and Caitlin are doing a lot of talking around grading, assessment, stuff like that. But because the way that we assess, and if we align our assessments properly, tier them properly, they help format and create what our instruction is, right? Can you talk through tiered assessment? How do we do that? What does that mean, first off? How do I build a tiered assessment based on all this stuff that we've already covered so far in the first 45 minutes here? Because that's sort of the next, that's what we already kind of got there a little bit, but we didn't necessarily hit that part of it particularly. So
tiering assessment, it can be done on a micro scale for like quick checks, formative assessments. So that's just making sure that are the questions you're looking at or asking, measuring the level of cognitive ability you actually want them to do. But the other aspect of it is if we look at it at a macro scale and we say a unit test or a chapter test or something like that, most teachers just give like a 50-point quiz at the test at the end of the unit, and they go, 1 grade in the grade book. You got an 86% on unit 7, and we're going to call it a day. Good job. Then the question I often ask teachers is, how many objectives or standards were covered on that test? And they go, I don't know, 10, 8, 7, like whatever, depending on the class they're in. And I go, so which one of those 7 objectives do they know 86% of? And they just look at me like I got bugs crawling out of my ears for a minute, because they're like, what do you mean? I go, which one of those objectives do they know 86% of? Or do they know 86% of every single one of those objectives? And they're like, well, I don't know. And I'm like, I don't either. And that's a problem.
Yeah.
So,
and neither will that student either when they get the feedback.
Student, neither will that parent, neither will that administrator that's looking at the same data. So we need to stop looking at assessment as some sort of like arbitrary separate thing from learning. And Dave Schmidow, who I'm pretty sure is watching right now, one of the things that he has showed me recently that I've been trying to really kind of put to practice is assessment is a fluid thing. An assessment can be formative or summative depending on how it is applied, right? So he kind of got me to change my vernacular of formatively assessing, which means learning is supposed to be still happening or occurring, or summatively assessing, which is after learning has supposed to have occurred. Now, if you continue learning after a summatively given assessment, you can transition that into, say, it was formative because now they're growing further. So another type of assessment. So
your summative assessment could be formative in the sense of
so the idea that like we give these labels to things, right, makes it so just like arbitrary, when learning is a continuum. Learning is a process. It doesn't have to end or start at a certain spot all the time, and every single one of our kids is in these pathways at different spots. So we need to start looking at, when we assess, we're just measuring a moment in time. That is all you are doing with assessment. There is not good, there is not bad, there is just what it is. And that's something I think needs to be understood universally because of remote learning, because of going back to normal, quote unquote, and everything else, right? If you have learned one thing, grading, feedback, and assessment are not supposed to punish kids. They are supposed to identify where they are. No more, no less. I hear it all the time. Well, I want to give them an A because they worked really hard. Doesn't matter.
You can give them a high five for working really hard.
Right.
Right.
Give them a hug.
Give them a positive feedback. Give them,
So it identifies where a student is at on a given topic or in a certain content at a given point in time. That does not mean that it can't change. That does not mean that it can't get better or worse. It's just, where are you right now? period. End of story. That is the only thing that feedback or a grade should provide, the snapshot of a moment in time. And if a grade represents, or feedback or an assessment is supposed to represent anything else besides that, it's broken, in my opinion. Like, period. End of story. It is a moment in time. Because I want you to think about this. If you took a third grade reading test and you failed it, does that mean you are never going to be able to read past the third grade?
No, I'd probably fail a third grade reading test right now, to be honest.
But just to be fair, we know that student will eventually improve. And if we identify and go, nope, that kid's they failed their third grade reading test, so they're never going to read. That's never going to happen. So we're going to just there's no reason to do that to a kid who's trying to learn how to read. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's the same thing when we talk about retakes. One thing I'm never going to argue with it. Well, I'll argue with anyone, but they're going to be wrong, so it's okay. But I will refuse to argue with people about if they should give retakes. That is something that you are wrong if you don't think students can grow in a span of time in your class. If you think it's more important that they know something on Monday rather than they know it, period, you're wrong. You're just wrong. I will literally argue with anyone about this, and I'm okay with that because I'm pretty sure I'm right. So, and here's the thing. The LSAT, the driver's test, graduate courses, ACT, SAT, they all let retakes happen. So why are we arguing about third grade spelling tests? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That doesn't make any sense to me. So you're saying a doctor can retake the licensure exam to do heart surgery, but Bobby can't try to spell believe again. Like, that doesn't make sense. Yeah. It's ridiculous. And it's not a good argument, right? We always say, well, they got to learn how the real world. No, they have to learn math and reading and science, right? Like, they're going to have plenty of time to learn about the real world. And I'm not saying we should ignore that stuff, but we need to know what we're measuring, how we're measuring it, and why we're measuring it, and get rid of everything else.
Yeah.
Because, like, the same thing goes with, I don't even know where I am in my tangent right now, but I'm just kind of going.
You're good, man. You're on fire. It's great. The quarter's going. Time's just going. It's good.
So the other aspect we have to talk about, though, is like grading for things that have nothing to do with understanding. Like, did you turn?
I was thinking the exact same thing. I just didn't say it.
That's why I used it, right? It's just.
I'm like, I don't know. What's harder, heart surgery or spell and believe? I'm just saying, like, outside of breath and breathe, I'm pretty sure. Go on. Go ahead, Chad. You're still going. So, Dave just threw you off, but you're good.
But, like, these are fundamental questions we have to ask ourselves. Are we still grading because a kid turned in tissue boxes at the beginning of the year? Are we still giving points for effort because we like a kid? Are we still taking points away because we don't like a kid or because they're disruptive or not doing neat work? Tell me how much neatness affects if a kid knows something or not. Guess what? The smartest people in the world with the greatest IQs were the sloppiest people. You ever see Einstein's desk or some of the greatest authors in the world? They look like archaeological dig sites, right? Because, like, I'm not even joking. Like, I've literally seen this. Some of the people that have changed the world were messy, not organized people. So we need to stop measuring students versus these things that aren't their understanding, their mastery, or their understanding or their competency, because doing it any other way is dangerous. And it's dangerous both ways. Inflating a grade is really dangerous because it means a kid might not get what they need in terms of services, in terms of intervention, in terms of help. I've literally seen this happen, right? The other way is a kid doesn't do any homework, but they know all the material. I had a teacher tell me one time, well, they failed even though they got an A on the test because they didn't do any of their homework. They obviously didn't need to do their homework if they got an A on the test.
Yeah.
So what's our goal? To teach them how to do homework? What's the purpose of the homework in the first place? Practice, so they learn. He already learned it. Why does he need to practice? Like, you're literally talking yourselves in circles at this point, right? So we need to make sure the grade, the feedback, the conversations are about what do you know, not what you're doing, not how many blanks you fill, but we want to help you grow and learn and think. And that's what all of this, and I know I've been going for a minute, so I don't know where this started, but this is kind of going to be where it ends for a second. But
it started somewhere around 2015. We're good.
there you go. Yeah. But these are all just like general best practices and thoughts you need to be having. As we return back, a lot of teachers realized, they said, my school, we don't want to be failing students. And I said, well, what does failing a student mean? Right? Like, we need to be having these conversations. We need to be having these facilitated discussions about what is the difference between failing or not passing a student and identifying their current level of understanding. Because I could argue we could move a student from 5th grade to 6th grade if I know where their gaps are, because the 6th grade teacher now knows where their gaps are and they can address those needs.
Yeah.
So
I think that it comes back. You said it earlier, and we've said it a bunch, a lot over the last 12 months or so, or even more than that. But you said it earlier. You said there's no good, there's no bad, right? There's no good, there's no bad. There's no ahead, there's no behind. It just is what it is. And I think that's a huge key to that. And that drives a force of like, and that goes in like what you were talking about, where Dave talked about, like, the assessment isn't to figure out, are they doing well? Are they not doing well? Are they doing good? Are they good, bad, ahead, behind, whatever? It's to figure out, where are they at? Right. And what do I do next to get them to where they're supposed to be if they're not already there? And if they are already there, where's the next place we're going? That's what I love, the idea of like the summative assessment, figure out, did we get there? Yeah, the kid got there. Okay, great. Where are we going next? Because now that was just formative, because now we're just going to figure out what the next step is. So, it was good, Chad. You did good, man. We're good. We got just a couple minutes left here. I actually get to join our amazing podcast network podcasters with Josh and Ray and do a training here in a couple minutes. Really appreciate everyone dropping in the comments, watching, and hanging out all this week for our Teacher Appreciation Week and our 7 days of live PD here. We're still going. Tomorrow it continues. Sunday it continues. So tomorrow, got a special, speaking of Josh Stamper, he is bringing on our good friend Maurice Martin, and they're talking about counseling and after crisis. And this is Maurice's wheelhouse. I can tell you're getting excited, so I'm going to let you speak.
I'm just going to say, Josh Stamper and Maurice Martin are probably two of like the
I'm super excited for this one.
Like the best kept. I don't want to say secrets, because they're not secrets, but like if you
weapons, can we say weapons? Is that we probably shouldn't say weapons either? But yeah,
well, either way. But they're like, to me, in terms of our team, in terms of like amazing members of our team that don't get to be heard all the time, or like maybe people like, you need to tune in for that. Like, you're going to miss something amazing. Like both of them just speak gold all the time. And there's so much value there.
So so Maurice Martin is one of our Speakers Network speakers, and Joshua Stamper, who I just mentioned, because he runs our podcast network. That's where they're talking on. And then we wrap up our 7-day series on Sunday with featuring the one and only Ray Hewitt, talking about reflection and continual growth. And that's going to be moderated by Olivia Chan. So there's another dynamic duo that's going to be a whole bunch of fun. So make sure you join us, both of those, and continue on there. And then obviously these are all open for replays on our YouTube channel or any of our social media, so you can keep getting more and more and more. Always reach out if you need anything at all. And we will see you tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern time with Josh and Maurice. Appreciate you all. Have an amazing rest of your Friday. Have a great weekend. We appreciate you. We love you. Let us know if there's anything we can do for you. So yeah, appreciate you, brother. Thanks for coming on, Chad.
Of course.